Bitcoiners, welcome back to another episode of the Bitcoin Magazine podcast. I have an especially excellent episode for all of y'all. I'm sitting down with Brian Morgenstern, the head of policy for Riot Platforms. We are going to talk about all things mining. We're going to also talk about all things mining and public policy in the US. There's a lot to get into here, as this is probably one of the most topical subjects in Bitcoin right now. So, Brian, welcome to the show. Excited to have you here.
Thanks, CK. Pleasure to be here. Yes, there is a lot to dig into that is important to the future of Bitcoin mining, especially in America.
Yeah. So, I mean, Brian, you're the head of public policy over at Riot Platforms. Also, you're involved with the Texas Blockchain Council. We got to meet for the first time in Nashville at the Bitcoin Park Lightning Summit, and we're talking a little bit about, what's happening in public policy and Bitcoin. We decided, hey, we got to get you on the show to talk about it. So why don't you just introduce yourself? Who is Brian Morgenstern? What do you do in Bitcoin? How did you discover Bitcoin? I know that's a lot, so I'm just going to pass it over to you.
Sure, yeah. So head of public policy for Riot, obviously one of America's biggest, if not the biggest, Bitcoin mining companies. I got into the space. I first got interested in the space because I worked at the US Treasury Department, and back in 2017, 2018 timeframe, I guess it was, we were doing a report on financial technology and how different areas of the fintech space should be regulated. And that was kind of when I really became most interested in Bitcoin. I already knew about it. I think I had a Coinbase account, I was kind of dabbling in it, but that was when I started to dig into it and really became interested. From the Treasury Department, I went on to work at the White House doing press and communications for President Trump towards the end of the administration. And then after leaving the administration, had done a lot of multi-client consulting work, and then came across Riot. They were recruiting for a head of public policy, somebody who knew how the government worked. Well, previously in my career, I worked for a congressman. I worked on the Natural Resources Committee, doing energy policy. Had worked at the Treasury Department of the White House doing financial services policy. So I sort of had the relevant background that would converge and help me assist Riot in navigating the space. I've since come to learn about Texas and the energy grid there and how we interact with it, as well as all the different moving parts here in Washington, D.C. But it is the most interesting, I think one of the most important debates going on right now, and it will continue to be for the next couple of years. So when Riot offered me the chance to come in-house and work on these things, I jumped at it, and it has not disappointed. It's been so interesting meeting Bitcoiners from across the country, getting even more deeply involved in Bitcoin and more passionate about it. The more I learn, and I find this with everybody, the more you learn about it, the more you like it, the more passionate you become. And I'm trying to impart that to members of Congress so that the future is going to be even brighter than I think it already is.
No, absolutely. I mean, your story in particular, it's almost like the perfect case study for Bitcoin, from Treasury to Bitcoin. I think that is honestly ideal. And, I couldn't think of someone who is, kind of has the better experience in terms of, going from the Treasury, working in public policy, working for senators, and then now taking a passion of Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining and trying to communicate that back out to lawmakers. Can you talk a little bit more about what it was like discovering Bitcoin, being at the Treasury, and what was like your progression in terms of learning more and liking more about the tech?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was a deputy assistant secretary for external affairs. Part of my job was, press and communications. Part of it was dealing with lobbying and private companies who would come in and try to educate us in the government about what they were doing and how the landscape was going to change. And part of our mandate was helping the government keep up because it's slow. It is an aircraft carrier when you're trying to turn that ship. And it sort of was evident to me pretty early on that the world is heading towards, and everyone wants, faster, cheaper payments. that was the first point that resonated with me so much that helped me realize that kind of further Bitcoin adoption and getting near sort of universal and ubiquitous awareness, if not use, was right around the corner. That's before we even got into kind of the sound money aspects, which is something that, now we have a presidential candidate, RFK Jr., talking about that. That's not exactly a left-wing fantasy. That's something that's been talked about for years by conservative economists like Art Laffer, Larry Kudlow, Steve Moore, and others who are sort of stalwarts of the right. Now you have a number of Democrats talking about it because easy money policy at the Fed combined with profligate spending in terms of fiscal policy is going to lead to a less stable existing financial system. So this idea that sound money is possible in a digital form was kind of the next sort of aha moment that I had. And the more we can keep communicating that to policymakers, I think the better off we're going to be. But it was that the fast, cheap, like immediate global payments struck me as something that everybody's striving for, and Bitcoin is already doing it. But the government really needed to catch up and get with the program.
No, I think that that makes a lot of sense. It sounds like, you had a lot of priming in terms of just you studied economists and thinkers and things like that, but also being in touch with what industry players are asking for. When you first kind of discovered Bitcoin, did it click right away? Or was it something that you kind of had to warm up to? And then talk about like the mining element, because that's not necessarily attached to fast payments and or sound money, but it is very important and unique.
Sure. So for me, it did take a little bit of warming up because because I lived in the environment of conventional wisdom, like the sort of, I don't know, what you think of as the DC swamp. Like I said, it's an aircraft carrier. It is not nimble. It is not fast moving. So certain patterns of thought really get ingrained. So it did take a little bit of time for me to kind of open my mind to it and realize the incredible value of it. I wish it had happened faster, frankly, but I now watch others go through this evolution, and it's really fun because I get to impart my experience and help people kind of come along for the ride. I will say the mining aspect is something that a lot of people don't understand because it's complicated. But now the battle, I think, now we get into the real cynical world of politics because Bitcoin has competitors, or at least a lot of other entities creating tokens, things like that, that are trying to seem like competitors to Bitcoin, even though I think a lot of Bitcoiners would recognize they're completely different products. But they try to muddy the waters so that they can get a favorable policy outlook and get more market share. It's sort of a tale as old as time in terms of the policy world. But with respect to mining, the issues are myriad, from energy use, some of those forces that are out to get us want to scapegoat us and say we use too much electricity, trying to keep people up to speed that in the grand scheme of things, we use actually very little electricity. Air conditioning uses 20x the electricity of the entire global Bitcoin network. Steel mills, chemical plants, traditional data centers, the travel industry, the fashion industry, all these industries use a lot of energy, a lot more than Bitcoin mining. So why are you singling out Bitcoin mining and saying that electricity use is bad? Well, there must be some underlying reason, right? It's because people either see Bitcoin as a competitor to something they're doing, or they don't know enough about it yet and they don't trust it yet. So it is an education curve, and there's a lot of propaganda and FUD that we have to bust. So it's a very fun and interesting process, but there's a lot of forces out there coming at us that we have to fight.
No, definitely. And, as the head of public policy at Riot, I'm sure, you're kind of on the front lines there. And I do want to dive into this actual battle that you are on, you're waging day to day, really, in terms of educating policymakers and the public in general. But before that, I kind of want to talk a little bit more about Riot in particular, right? So Riot is one of the largest, if not the largest, hash rate producing organizations in the US. Riot has been building a lot of great infrastructure on the ground in Texas and in other places in the US. Can you just talk about what the operation looks like? Who is Riot? And we can go from there.
Yeah, and it's a great question. It's a story I love to tell because it's an excellent one. So uh, the site where Riot is currently operational is in Rockdale, Texas. It's about an hour to an hour and a half outside of Austin. And it's the former site of an Alcoa smelting plant. Well, in a community of about 5,000 Texans, that Alcoa plant was the biggest employer by far. The plant shut down. Well, when like 500 jobs in a community of 5,000 go away, that is devastating. So Riot was able to use that site and convert it into what is amongst the largest Bitcoin mines in the world, certainly in North America. And we're now the largest employer in that county. And we have about 250 employees, several hundred contractors who work at the site or who have worked at the site. We're now building another site in Corsicana, Texas, which is south of Dallas, and that's going to be a gigawatt. That's going to be an even bigger facility. So that's a community of, I think, 20,000 or so, give or take. So another several hundred jobs in a community like that, a rural community, is a huge impact. We in Rockdale, where we currently exist, I think we're the biggest taxpayer in the school district. Sales tax in that area has exploded. So there's a lot more resources for schools and youth programs and everything else, all the other benefits of that economic development. We're able to use a lot of wind and solar power that's going into the grid. It's intermittent. It would otherwise be wasted energy. It's renewable because we're there in that area. We're using it. We're buying it. And then in peaks, when it's really hot, like now in the summer, we can sell energy back to the grid, help stabilize it. It's a wonderful story in terms of our impact in Texas. Texas has been very good to us, and we want to be very good back to the communities where we operate. We have some executives in different areas of the country, but really the core of our operations is there in Texas. We also supply our own mines with electrical switchgear equipment from Colorado, a company that's under the Riot umbrella. And we try to be very vertically integrated. We want to control as many variables as possible. I think it's a market differentiator for us. I think analysts and investors appreciate that, that we kind of, as much as we can, try to control the supply chain. We just announced an agreement with MicroBT for domestically manufactured miners.
Huge.
We're eliminating a lot of that supply chain friction, people getting things from Asia. It can take a long time. You have a lot of governments that are in the way at various steps of the process. So that's another way that we're really kind of smoothing out the bumpy road in what's a pretty new operation, but I think we're maybe the most robust operation there is, and we're professionalizing. It's a new industry, but we're really bringing in the best and brightest to make the best facilities, the most efficient operating facilities that we can.
Yeah, and I guess just to summarize, what you said and zoom out a little bit, really what's happening is within Bitcoin, there's an incentive for people to plug machines in to mine Bitcoins. And it's gotten to the point now where there are very sophisticated, large public organizations that are really masters at building excellent data centers and excellent infrastructure and creating really strong supply chains. And Riot has, kind of been one of the front runners there. And then in particular, Riot is operating huge facilities in Texas. And this kind of gets into the next area of the conversation, which is like, what is the benefit of having these huge facilities in Texas? What is the benefit for the Texas grid or any local grid for having these data centers that are specifically mining Bitcoin. You kind of touched on this, in terms of like the jobs that are provided. But Brian, why don't you just like zoom out a little bit? Talk about the problem that these communities are facing, right? You mentioned the Alcoa plant leaving, jobs leaving. Like what's the high level problem in terms of these rural areas, the resources they have and their inability to create value with them? And how does Bitcoin mining fit into that?
So, when certain jobs, well, I mean, manufacturing jobs, other types of, kind of good blue collar, middle class workforce positions were leaving these areas, or you have a rural area without a lot of economic development happening.
And I guess why were they leaving too? Why is the Alcoa plant cutting these jobs?
Well, I won't speak for Alcoa, but lots of companies have, moved or outsourced or brought their operations to different jurisdictions because they can do things more cheaply. And in Texas, so there's a few issues. So one is it's not unique to Texas, but a lot of rural areas can benefit from more economic development. And what those areas often have at the same time is sometimes there's energy that was stranded, maybe a plant like Alcoa left, or sometimes they need a company that will consume energy to help invest in the infrastructure to transmit energy. Like wind and solar are intermittent, and it's not easy yet to transport those types of energy from the rural areas where the sun is shining and the wind is blowing to Dallas or to Austin or other population centers. But if you have a business that goes out there to create a baseload of demand, well, then all of a sudden you're going to have an investment in infrastructure to create a more robust sort of environment where power is more available for growing businesses, for growing a community. So Bitcoin mining can be sort of a first entrant and create a really nice baseload, help invest in the power transmission so that all of a sudden you can have even more economic development in that area. That means, like I said, supporting all different kinds of energy that would otherwise be wasted. You're not taking energy away from people, but you're creating more transmission to that area. And then now it's happening right now in Texas. There's a huge heat wave. It's been over 100 degrees for a long time. June and July have both been extremely hot months. So now that you have Riot there with long-term power contracts, well, all of a sudden when it's really hot and people need air conditioning to be turned on, medical facilities may be consuming more energy, all sorts of things that are leading to peak demand. In fact, recently, the Texas demand and supply almost met. We almost had 100%, which could have then led to like rolling blackouts and things, which can be really harmful when it's 110 degrees outside. So Riot was able to power down, sell power back to the grid, and get things under that peak supply level so that there were no rolling blackouts. We were helping to stabilize the grid. So additional to the economic development, it's energy development, it's grid stability. We are very big donors to the local youth programs, to the Chamber of Commerce, to the FOP, the law enforcement organizations. There's all sorts of things that happen when you have several hundred people working to operate a Bitcoin data center in rural Texas. It makes a huge difference in multiple facets of people's lives. But definitely in economic development, energy development, and grid stability, those are just a few of the main things. But we're making a huge difference in these communities, and it's terrific. The workforce is awesome. They're great people. And so it's this really supportive ecosystem that has resulted from us moving in there.
I mean, Brian, I really appreciate you kind of teasing that out. And in terms of like the three elements that you brought up, I think that there's a great story in terms of the support and the support to the community and the jobs in that local area that Riot creates. But I really do think the last point, which is the grid stability that large Bitcoin on-grid Bitcoin data centers can produce, is the thing that actually has the most impact on Texas, and if adopted, the United States or any jurisdiction that adopts it. Because the reality is there's this thing called the duck curve, So the duck curve is kind of like it's a graph visualization of power demand over the course of the day. So pretty much there's a lot of power demand in the morning, and then there's even more power demand in the evenings. And then during the middle of the day and during the middle of the night, obviously the demand drops off. And really what energy providers are doing is they're trying to match demand with generation. And what Bitcoin mining does is Bitcoin mining fills out the rest of the duck curve. So effectively, all the areas in the day where energy is not being used, Bitcoin mining can fill that out in terms of taking that energy and not wasting it. And then if you zoom out, like during the summer and during the winter, and then during the spring and the fall, there's different energy demands, and Bitcoin mining can fill the rest of that out. So that is the long-term ultimate potential of Bitcoin mining, which is like creating stability for once ever in energy grids. And that is almost like changing the paradigm in energy grids. And people just don't understand how big of a deal that is. I want to pass it back to you to maybe just comment on that vision. Is that something that you think about as you're trying to educate people about why mining and why Riot?
We do, and all the time. And we're very proud because the former interim CEO of ERCOT, which is the grid operator in Texas, is now an advisor to Riot. And he's been very pro Bitcoin, and not for the sort of standard Bitcoiner reasons of freedom money and sound money, but because of the grid stability issue. Because he saw it when he was running ERCOT. He saw the benefits that Bitcoin miners bring to the grid and has spoken about that duck curve. Because during those interim hours, when people leave for work and they come home for work, during those hours, particularly in a rural community, there isn't a lot of demand. But guess what's being generated? Solar and wind, a lot of times, intermittent energies that would otherwise be wasted. Well, we're creating a baseload demand for that. So we are incentivizing energy innovation and stabilizing demand for the grid and making sure that transmission to these areas, which otherwise might not have a reason for robust energy transmission, we're there to ensure that it happens and invest in the infrastructure. And it benefits those rural communities. And you're seeing it obviously where we are in Texas. There's other states where it's happening as well. But it's a great benefit to the grid because Bitcoin miners are location agnostic. They just want the cheapest, most abundant, available stranded energy. And it turns out that when you facilitate more generation and more transmission, human communities flourish. That tends to be what happens. And we are proving it every day.
No, absolutely. I think that there's a direct correlation between energy production and consumption, and then quality of life and innovation and human potential. So if Bitcoin mining and Riot in particular can improve that for Americans and for the world, that's a direct improvement on everyone's lifestyle. So I think, again, the potential here can't be understated. I guess my question for you, Brian, is why locally in Texas and even federally in the US are lawmakers and lobbyists fighting the expansion of Bitcoin mining? Why is this just not taking off like wildfire?
There's a variety of reasons. One is a tremendous amount of distrust and misunderstanding. And another thread is sort of more nefarious and cynical than that. So certain politicians don't like the idea of a decentralized network because it takes power away from central banks, large financial institutions, you name it. A lot of their allies in their political life. This threatens that setup. So they will find any reason they can to come after us. So they'll come after us for energy use and say that we're boiling the oceans. And people who don't understand our business or our industry might believe that. They will come after us and say we are criminal money and we're powering terrorist organizations and drug lords and stuff. Of course, when you look at the data from Chainalysis and other organizations who actually research this, that's not true either. But you can, those are two prominent examples. There are other examples as well, where they'll just find a line of attack because they, on a philosophical level, don't like the idea of Bitcoin. Others are more well-meaning, but have been miseducated. I think we have, politics flows downhill from culture. So I think Bitcoin culture is growing. We have to help it grow faster. We have to get the right data and information out there faster. Something that I do, I burn through shoe leather every day, telling the true story of what we're doing and how we're benefiting communities. Our opponents are well-funded legacy industries who are trying to get ahead of us. And we see it on a number of fronts, from large financials who are now, now there's sort of an unholy alliance between bank lobbyists and Senator Elizabeth Warren, who she's like their number one critic. That is perhaps the most cynical thing I've seen in my political career. That's like a mob setup where like she's going to have them try to kill us, and then if they succeed in killing us, she'll turn the guns right back on them. So I'm hopeful that through our educational efforts, we'll head these sorts of things off at the pass. In Texas, there's a lot of legacy industries, some funders of gas-powered peaker plants that typically would benefit from peaking demand and who don't like to see us participate in demand response very effectively because we're so flexible. They might see that as a threat, so they might be pushing some of some bills that would hurt our industry. Ultimately, there's always an agenda behind it. That's one thing I've learned in my career. If you get a New York Times front page hit piece on you, it means you've really made it, because people are starting to take you seriously as a threat, and they're really coming after you. And so that, some people saw that as a bad thing. I think if people have learned, it's that it's always somebody's agenda being driven. And so I think from this kind of enlightenment that's happening post-COVID, I think Bitcoin will benefit from that. But I don't know if that answered your question. It was a long stream of consciousness, but that's what it made me think of.
No, no, you did answer the question. I definitely want to dive in a little bit deeper to specifically what's happening in Texas as well as the federal level. But what I'll let you say your dialogue kind of brought into my head is, what do gas, let's just call it fossil fuel peaker plants, and Elizabeth Warren have in common? Apparently, it's a coalition with the bankers and a hatred for Bitcoin mining. So not very good company for Elizabeth, who's apparently, supposedly be a woman of the people and someone who is, sticking it to the big bankers. It's ironic that she finds herself, kind of at odds with what I would say is the people's money, which is Bitcoin, and then probably the most innovative energy management and I guess, yeah, I would just say energy management and environmental technology ever invented, in terms of our modern power grids, which is, distributed proof of work with Bitcoin.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that time will tell that this really has been quite cynical, not very honest behavior on her part. Because if you are advocating for the people, then you should want empowerment people, which Bitcoin does. And if you care about the climate, then you should want the most innovative energy sources you can, the most sustainable energy sources you can find. And who's going to buy that energy that's not otherwise being used, as you spoke about with the duck curve? Well, that's Bitcoin miners. So when you get down to it, on any of these threads, the criminal money piece, AML, KYC, sort of terrorist financing, illicit finance, that was something I worked on a lot at the Treasury Department. Well, one of the most effective tools our government has these days is the immutable ledger. And there have been front page stories about billions of dollars of stolen Bitcoin being found and tracked down, and people being prosecuted for misusing it and abusing the system, because the decentralized ledger is transparent and immutable. So when you talk about financial inclusion and empowering people, it's Bitcoin that does that, but they attack it. When you talk about climate and energy use, it's Bitcoin that's fueling innovation and reducing emissions, but for some reason they attack it. You talk about AML KYC issues and money, financial systems being abused. Well, the decentralized ledger fixes that. Yes, for some reason they attack it. So when you pull the thread on the sweater, you realize what's behind this? It's a political philosophical difference, or it's protecting legacy industries, or whatever it may be. But when you start to dig in, you realize that all the arguments against Bitcoin tend to be red herrings, and they collapse like a house of cards as soon as you actually learn the facts. And that's why I think the future is so bright, and that these attacks are going to be overcome.
No, I mean, again, I 100% agree. And it's easy to agree with other Bitcoiners on this, but for whatever reason, it's difficult to let people who haven't kind of spent the time and put in the work for them to see it. And again, it doesn't help that, you have the Biden administration really, having like an anti-Bitcoin perspective, which, it's not a huge surprise, but at the same time, there's so much evidence and there's so much, I guess, education that's contrary. Can you talk about a little bit what we're seeing from the executive branch and help the readers or the listeners understand a little bit more about, I guess, what is the current attack on the Bitcoin mining industry?
Sure. So there's a number of them. One was late last year, the administration issued a report on digital assets, and they talked specifically about mining, and they expressed concerns about environmental impacts. That included, the energy use, where they said you have to generate a lot of fossil fuel based energy in order to power the Bitcoin mines. That's leading to more emissions. Of course, mines don't emit anything, they're computer data centers, but they talked about the energy that has to be generated, and that results in emissions. Okay, well, as we've said, every industry that uses energy results in emissions. On a global basis, the Bitcoin network uses 0.2% of energy. So why are they coming after us? Well, probably cynical political reasons. They've tasked the EPA and the Department of Energy with studying our environmental impacts and potentially limiting Bitcoin mining in the US, or even banning it. So they're exploring that. Nothing's appears imminent. There's a lot of study that has to go in before policies are announced. But the fact that they did that really sort of telegraphs a big risk. Also, at the beginning of this year, the banking regulators issued notices that they thought digital asset is not unique to Bitcoin, but digital asset companies presented risks to the financial system. So they thought the digital asset space and the financial system really should be separate. Well, that led to banks kicking companies out of their bank accounts. And as big a company as Riot is, there were some banks that became kind of uncomfortable with us. Now we have diverse banking relationships, we have subsidiaries, we have, we're doing okay. But imagine a younger company, a less mature company, can't get a checking account. We're talking about US dollars to pay your employees, and these companies were getting kicked out of their banks. So that was another threat. We've seen, the SEC, of course, regulating by enforcement. We're anticipating a climate disclosure rule coming out. We think that people who don't like Bitcoin mining are probably going to take those disclosures and try to cherry pick them and attack Bitcoin miners, again, for environmental reasons. We have any number of attacks, right? We had a number of White House policy offices come out and sort of echo the concerns with respect to bank stability, echo the concerns with respect to environmental impact. So the administration has really taken a pretty hostile view. Where we're getting a great deal of traction is with members of Congress, particularly younger members of Congress, who see the promise. They see the advantage of financial inclusion, that anybody can use the Bitcoin network. They see the advantage of faster, cheaper payments. Some members have sort of advanced into the sound money space, and they see the value in that, of having a commodity-backed monetary system is inherently more stable. We've seen a lot of oversight letters come from Congress and some participation in congressional hearings across the aisle, people, Republicans and Democrats, who are really kind of opening their eyes to the promise of Bitcoin. So while the administration's been hostile, a lot of members of Congress are not. And so that's why I think on a long-term basis, we're going to continue to win. But we have been facing some headwinds with the administration. There's no question about that.
No, I mean, again, I think that it's really interesting to hear you talk about making progress in Congress. And I want to bring up the point that it's been really fascinating to kind of see Bitcoin be one of the very few issues to actually be bipartisan. And, you've obviously been involved in public policy for a long time. Have you seen an issue that has demonstrated so much potential in crossing that political chasm?
There have always been some. Look, I mean, during times of crisis, there's often a lot of bipartisanship. At the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, when everyone was kind of trying to figure out what was going on, people were getting sick and dying, and the government needed to do something. So during those early days, when we passed the CARES Act, hindsight's 2020. We now know a lot more than we did then. But at the time, during a time of uncertainty, my boss at the time, Secretary Mnuchin at the Treasury Department, had negotiated a temporary aid package to help us get through those initial months. And it passed unanimously, I think, in the Senate. It may have been unanimous in the House. If it wasn't, it was, only a couple of votes against, but like 400 votes for it. So, I mean, like tremendous bipartisanship. So that's just one example. Point being, it happens. It feels like we're always divided and super divided. Not necessarily, but this is really interesting. This time is really interesting because of the strange bedfellows that I'm seeing. On the House side, there's been some folks who want to be loyal to the administration. They don't want to vote for anything that would even remotely promote Bitcoin or any other digital asset. There are others who are more thoughtful and enthusiastic. I mean, you had Warren Davidson. Here's an anecdote. He's a congressman from Ohio, hugely pro-Bitcoin. He's extremely conservative. He's probably one of the most conservative members of the House. And Richie Torres, who represents the Bronx, who may be one of the most liberal members of the House, come together and work together on digital asset legislation because they both see the promise of it. They both see it as empowering people. Richie Torres comes from a district where remittances sent to family members overseas is a big issue. Bitcoin is, of course, extremely helpful for that. Warren Davidson's platform is trying to fit the government inside the confines of the Constitution and favors sound money. So he has other reasons for taking that position. But from completely opposite ends of the political aisle, of the political spectrum, and for different reasons, they've come together and supported Bitcoin. And just a couple of weeks ago, the Senate Finance Committee, where Republicans and Democrats do not agree very often on tax policy, came together and issued a bipartisan request for information on how should we be taxing digital assets? What is a Bitcoin mining reward? Are you self-creating an asset? In other words, are you pulling the gold out of the mountain, or are Bitcoin miners providing a service to the network, helping to secure it, and they get a fee for that service when they get their Bitcoin mining rewards? Well, I think that's a very thoughtful question, and I'm glad it came on a bipartisan basis. And I think you'll see accounting firms, you'll see miners like Riot, you'll see trade associations like the Chamber of Digital Commerce, provide really good and thoughtful answers to that. And it shows that they're interested in updating the nation's laws to reflect reality. What a refreshing thought. And it's happening with Republicans and Democrats coming together because they both see the promise of this. It's not necessarily for the same reasons all the time, but they really do see kind of where things are headed, and they want to be a part of it, and they don't want to get shut out of it, and they don't want America to be shut out of it, more importantly, because there's so many jurisdictions across the world opening their arms to this. They really see the global competition. Who else is trying to mine Bitcoin? Well, the US is the world leader. Who else is trying to mine a lot of Bitcoin? Russia, for one. China supposedly banned it in 2021. Well, there's still one of the top mining jurisdictions around the world, whether that's the government, whether it's illegally, sort of dissident organization, whatever it may be. There's a tremendous amount of hash rate in China. It's a global competition, and Republicans and Democrats understand that. It gives me a lot of heart. It gives me a lot of enthusiasm and hope.
No, 100%. And, I want to turn again kind of back to your role, right? As, the head of policy at Riot, it's kind of a hand-to-hand combat, doing a lot of this educating on the ground. Can you talk a little bit about the approach with talking to lawmakers and what the day-to-day is like for you?
Yeah. So there's so many different things to touch on. I will, on any given day, perhaps we're talking about the market structure bill. There's a market structure bill moving through the House. We want to talk to members of those committees to make sure that, miners are not getting pulled into areas where they shouldn't be pulled into. If they're concerned about anti-money laundering issues, well, miners are not really implicated by that. They're not a bank. They're not a financial institution. They're not custodying anyone's assets. Some offices don't really understand that. It's worth talking to them and explaining to them what Bitcoin mining is. Sometimes if it's tax issues, we go and talk to members of the Ways and Means Committee or the Senate Finance Committee because they write tax laws. So we talk to them about what our business is and what it isn't, so they understand that. The administration had proposed a tax, an excise tax on the energy used by Bitcoin miners, which I think is a first of its kind. It is truly not for revenue. It's to manipulate behavior. It's a pretty scary way of going about it, declaring that a certain person is not allowed to buy electricity. I mean, that's inconsistent with the values of a free society. So kind of flagging that proposal, going to meet with members' offices, whether you're Republican, Democrat, pro-Bitcoin, anti-Bitcoin, or agnostic, that sort of a policy proposal is pretty dangerous. So we wanted to talk to people about that, take their temperatures, educate them about our business, make sure that they know that that is a dangerous policy. So things shift. It's constantly monitoring the news. It's constantly talking to people, educating people, figuring out what their concerns are, and then going back, doing some homework, figuring out a way to address those concerns and following up with them. And with 435 members of the House and 100 members of the Senate, in order to be most effective, you have to whittle down. So you figure out who gets it and appreciates it and favors it, who are our supporters, making sure they have the most up-to-date information. Who are our opponents? What are they talking about? How are they attacking us? How can we combat those attacks? And going about that. And then who's in the mushy middle, who can be persuaded? Mm-hmm. Who are their constituents? Do we have Bitcoin mines in their district or in their state? Are there other people who we can get to talk to them? Making sure that they understand where we're coming from, that we come in peace, that we are a legal business, that we are a really interesting, innovative business, that we're good for America and the world from a financial standpoint, from an energy standpoint. So we kind of whittle it down and prioritize in that way. But it's just constant conversations. It's a lot of fun. It's challenging, but it's a lot of fun.
What percentage, and I'm getting to the end of my questions here, but like what percentage of your time is split, with the local jurisdictions in Texas that Riot operates, and then versus like at the federal level?
It changes. The answer is it changes. So when the Texas legislature is in session for 3 months every 2 years. So during the end of session, there was a flurry of bills earlier this year. So I spent a lot of time in Austin. And so that was my primary focus. Now there's a lot of legislative activity. The House Financial Services Committee, House Agriculture Committee, they're just passing a flurry of bills that affected the digital asset industry. So I was on the Hill here in Washington quite a lot, and not in Austin. Now, out of the summer break in September, I'll spend time in each place because we have to lay the groundwork in Texas, building our relationships, educating the lawmakers during the interim. I'll spend some time there. I'll come back because I know there's going to be other bills or those bills moving forward and getting edited, amended in DC. So I'll be spending some time in DC as well. It sort of evolves. Sometimes it's kind of 50-50. Sometimes it's 90-10 in one direction or the other. It kind of depends a little bit on the legislative calendar and the news cycle and, what seems to be moving on any given day.
Speaking of the news cycle, and I think you already brought up RFK, who's taking on a very pro Bitcoin perspective. He's not the only politician who has actually Ron DeSantis, Vivek Ramaswamy, several others who are serious contenders have kind of had a pro Bitcoin perspective. Can you talk about like what you're anticipating with this upcoming election cycle in terms of Bitcoin's positioning, and then maybe even Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining as a key topic of debate?
Yes. So we have the potential to make a real difference in this election. So the first question I think Bitcoiners should consider is, where can we really make a difference on the margins? Ohio is a very important state because it's not only a big state for presidential politics, it also has a Senate election going right now. And the chairman of the Senate Banking Committee is Senator Sherrod Brown. And he has been not exactly clear on where he stands on these issues. He's very concerned about anti-money laundering issues, but otherwise has been sort of vague. So there's a pretty robust Bitcoin mining industry there. There's a blockchain council there. Senator J.D. Vance, the other senator, is a Bitcoiner. He holds Bitcoin. Candidates on the Republican side, Bernie Moreno, who I know, really believes in the promise of Bitcoin and blockchain, I believe. And so if you're able to make that global competitiveness argument and the financial inclusion argument and the energy stability argument in a state like Ohio, where you can really show that this could swing 10,000 votes one way or the other, you can change the outlook of the U.S. Senate or the presidential race in that way. Montana is another state where some pro-Bitcoin mining laws. The senator there, John Tester, was kind of pro-Bitcoin, then he was kind of anti-Bitcoin. If you can really galvanize the Bitcoin community in that state and make a difference around the margins, where maybe it's 5,000 votes or 10,000 votes in a close election in a state that kind of goes back and forth, all of a sudden we're a political force and we matter. And these politicians are going to have to carefully consider where they stand. So I'm very heartened to see some candidates coming out in our favor. I think the community, which tends to maybe lean more libertarian, could really start to become a political force in the US if it starts to target its efforts in some of these states. And so that's what one of the projects I'm working on is to try to make that happen, to try to get our people out of the woodwork, to try to make sure that we are being vocal to our elected officials and to our candidates and supporting the ones whose eyes have been opened, who understand what we're doing and why it's important. And on the other side, potentially imposing a cost on the ones who don't, the ones who buy into the myths, the ones who attack us, in unjustifiable ways. Well, then we should come out and vote against those people and make sure that they know it. So we have a great opportunity. The next election is, a year and 5 months or whatever it is. We have great potential to make a huge difference and become an impactful political force in this country. And I hope that we're able to do it. So I'm working on it. Anybody who wants to help me work on it, come talk to me. Let's do it. Let's make it happen.
Awesome. Well, Brian, I really wanted to thank you for coming on the show. I think this is a great place to wrap it up. And I'm also heartened, to have someone who has so much experience, who, really has worked on the other side of, the aisle from where Bitcoiners are in terms of the government and on the treasury side, and now have you, pushing our coalition forward. I want to pass it back to you for a last word for the Bitcoin Magazine audience.
Well, I want to thank you for having me. Thank you for welcoming me into the Bitcoiner community. It's been so much fun getting to know people and learning more about how innovative and interesting our community is. And I just want to make sure that we're being treated fairly. That is what I wake up and try to do every day. And our company, Riot, it is a total blessing. These people are so much fun and they're so smart. So just advocating on behalf of the company and the community has been a great joy. And I hope that our future is as bright as it should be. And together we can make sure that it is.
Well, Brian, I'll definitely be having you back on the show to consult next time. There's something that is pertinent happening in politics and in Bitcoin mining. Feel free to reach out anytime. And I want to thank you again for coming onto the show and for educating us about what is happening in your role and what is happening generally in terms of Bitcoin mining in the US. To all of the listeners watching, make sure to go give Brian a follow. Reach out to him if you're interested in getting involved in public policy and Bitcoin. If you are in one of the states he mentioned, make sure to go and get involved, make some noise. You can have an outsized impact in favor of Bitcoin. And ultimately, everyone out there, keep stacking sats, keep talking to people about why Bitcoin is good for your country that you live in, whether you live in the US or somewhere else, and keep going and meeting up with Bitcoiners. Ultimately, this is a community of people. Brian and I got to meet in person at an in-person event, and y'all can meet me this upcoming October at Bitcoin Amsterdam. So October 12th through the 13th in Amsterdam. Come meet me there. And, hopefully we'll have some amazing folks from the Riot team, folks from the entire industry are going to be in attendance. But with that, thank you so much for listening. We will be back with another episode soon. Thanks again to Brian for coming on. Peace.
Thank you, Miami, for the last 3 years in this amazing city. The whole world shut down, but Miami welcomed us with open arms. We want to show Bitcoin to the whole world. We are taking the conference on the road to set the stage for Bitcoin in a new city. Nashville. Bitcoin 2024 is coming to Nashville in Tennessee, a city that is known as a music and freedom city. Bitcoin 2024 in Nashville from July 25th to 27th.